Sociology of Education at MMU, and I'm running the seminar series. I'm organising the seminar series this year. And the ESRI seminar series has a long history, and every year we invite a collection of speakers to talk around a key theme. And this year's theme is Hard Times, Challenging Futures, Confronting Educational Inequalities. And today's seminar, we have three wonderful speakers. The seminar theme is Youth, Belonging, Struggles and Employment. And we have Stephen Threadgold from the University of Newcastle, Australia, where it is 9 p.m. So thank you so much, Stephen, for agreeing to staying up late to join us. We have Fergal Finnegan from Maynooth University, Ireland, and Anne-Marie Bathmaker from the University of Birmingham. Okay, I'm going to talk. This is the next seminar. I'm just going to do a little bit of a plug for that. Next time we have a seminar on the 24th of March, and the theme is Comparative Systems of Higher Education. And we have Rachel Brooks, Constantino Dumangain, and Maria Jose Alvarez Rivadula from Universidad de los Andes. So we've got an international speaker there as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to get Stephen, if you want to start the process of getting your slides on the screen, then we can go from there. Okay, you're pretty fast at that. You've got tech competencies that I don't. I'm a bit slow. Okay, so I'm really pleased to welcome Steve Threadgold. I'm really looking forward to this paper. Steve, as I said, was meant to join us last year, but and wasn't able to, obviously, because of the pandemic. So it's nice to have him speak today. I'm currently reviewing Steve's Bourdieu book at the minute, which I'm really enjoying reading. And Steve has been a real leader in youth research in Australia, and his recent book, another book that he has, I've forgotten the title of it because I haven't got my notes here, but Steve, you can say a little bit more about that. Recently won the Raewyn Connell Award in Australia, so that's a really prestigious award, and that well done, Steve, for that. I'm going to hand you over to Steve and let Steve introduce his paper. But Steve, actually, could you just say a little bit about that book and the award?
Yeah, sure. Everyone can hear me all right? Nicola, can you hear me? Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so thanks. The book is about I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the aspects of the book in the presentation about hipsters and bogans. But essentially, it's a kind of analysis of different aspects of class, both in terms in the hipsters and bogans stuff that I'll talk about in a sec, but also a research project I did quite a few years ago now with young kind of DIY punk and alternative scene kind of artists and musicians, and about their day-to-day lives and the various kind of struggles that they faced. So I'm not going to talk about the punk stuff too much, but I'll talk a little bit about the hipsters and bogan stuff in this one. So I think I'll get straight into it because, hang on a second, something's going on here. I think I've done the classic thing where I've kind of thought that this is kind of a new audience for me, so I'll try and do a bit of everything I've been doing. So I'm just going to provide a kind of snapshot of 4 different research projects that I've been doing, either by myself or more likely in a kind of team of researchers that we have here at Newcastle. The first one's about some work we've been doing with young people working in bars in Newcastle and in Melbourne. The second one's a kind of small project unfunded project that I've been doing kind of out of like almost a hobby for the past couple of years, which is about kind of class relations online. The third will be drawing from the Youth Class and Everyday Struggles book about hipsters and bogans. And the last is a very recent research project that was done with young hospitality workers who instantly pretty much lost their work when the COVID pandemic hit. So I'm going to kind of draw some kind of commonalities out of that research at the end to kind of talk about some kind of, I suppose, material, symbolic, and particularly affective relations of class. So I'll get right into it. The first is a I've got to draw upon the research of young people in bars. Now, this is particularly from a small case study that we did in the north suburbs of Melbourne, often referred to, as kind of hipster central in Melbourne. So it's a very specific kind of vibe there, very kind of subculture, again, relating to things like punk and DIY and art, and particularly around very leftist and progressive politics there. So it's important here to think about class, I think, in terms of its relationality. It's difficult to talk about these bar workers as coming from a class because they have lots of different backgrounds. Many people travel to Melbourne to live because of its kind of nightlife and artistic scene, but they're from all kinds of backgrounds and they come to study and stuff like that. But in terms of these jobs, they get them through word of mouth, introductions, things like, their possessions of certain types of subcultural capital and certainly people they know. So this is a kind of way of thinking about class, not necessarily as kind of a static, determined category, but kind of more blurry, and how kind of young people are passing through these spaces in various ways. Many of these young people are working in these jobs while they're studying or trying to set up an artistic career of some kind or another, whether that's music or whatever. But what we find too is some, don't finish their study, don't get the career that they wanted, and they end up kind of being bar workers, into their 30s and, probably a lot after as well. When we ask them about why they do the bar work, thinking about the illusio of bar work here, there's certainly the financial imperatives, in terms of, rent and eating and having fun and that kind of stuff. But particularly in this area, the people are working in bars that they love going to themselves, most of the time anyway, where they can be yourself. It's kind of like their lounge room. So what I'll talk about in this is some of the relations of class that develop in those spaces, particularly when these workers, mostly young people, have to deal with what are deemed as problems. And problems in these spaces are people, and they're people that are not behaving in the right way. They're drunk. They're more often drunk men, but they're quite often, the kind of people that don't fit into that space, and the owners don't really want them in there because it kind of messes up the vibe. So the directionality of these class relations can go up and down. And the workers talk about this quite openly. They often get a sense of enjoyment about kicking people out of places where they deem them above them in the class system, but tend to have a kind of ambivalent and sometimes, bad feelings about having to deal with people that they feel below them, because they tend to have quite leftist politics. So there's a strong social homology between venues and workers and punters in these places. But in this area that was particularly in recent past quite a working class place, there's really strong forces of gentrification going on. And the venues that these people are working in are part of that in many ways. They're kind of hipsterifying, and if you can put it like that. So the workers here often understand that they're part of that process. So you can see here that Carly here talks about us like working at a particular kind of what was a kind of old working class pub and how it's gentrified, and certain types of people aren't allowed to be served drinks. They're economically freezing out by putting all the drinks up. She feels gross about that, and she knows that she's a part of this gentrification process, but she also kind of gets why the owners want to kind of do that, because they want to make more money. So I kind of talk about this in a way as being, I suppose, the young people are kind of reflexively complicit in this. They don't like it politically, but they, kind of take part of it. They see it as part of the job. One of the things we've kind of noticed in this work, and particularly the way that the young bar workers have to regulate the space, is that I think that bar workers end up being a kind of everyday phenomenologist. They talk about being able to spot problems and problematic people as soon as they walk in, by judging them, obviously through things like, basic stereotypes of what they're wearing, but particularly through things like body language. So they talk about being able to spot an alcoholic a mile off. Someone walks in, the passive kind of ease, just walking in, you don't really look at them. But, if there's this other kind of aggressive or defensive body language you watch out for. And this is particularly the case when they suss out people that they think are coming in to steal things, or are drug addicts or alcoholics. These are indications of things that are people that aren't simply there to have a good time. So this kind of affective relations is the way that kind of the young bar workers are put in these kind of weird authority positions where they are I suppose, impelled to kind of create the right vibe of the place, and that depends on the aesthetic and the music and the kind of imagination of what the owners and the managers think the place should be. They then have to regulate the people within them, and this takes place through all this kind of affective and symbolic relations of class. For the workers themselves, this manifests in all kinds of different feelings. Sometimes it's pragmatic, sometimes they're ambivalent about it, sometimes they're disgusted by the people, but sometimes they feel guilt. And so there's a kind of all this kind of complex feelings going on in these spaces. So to conclude this part, just this kind of is what we're kind of drawing out here is the kind of affective, immaterial, and emotional labours are going on in this space. Young people's subjectivities, in particular in this space, their edgy, sexy, and cruel subjectivities, are being mined and co-opted here. These people are recruited because they have particular tastes, they look a particular way, they kind of help set up the vibe of the place that the owners are trying to set up to attract the right kind of people. And the young peoples often enjoy this. But what we can see here is the relationality of class emerging in these kind of everyday interactions. And these manifest in the mundane kind of ways that people kind of talk to each other, to a more kind of physically violent situation when someone has to get kicked out. The second snapshot that I want to talk about is the kind of the work I've been doing around online taste cultures. And I'm still kind of toying a little bit with what to call this. At the moment, I'm kind of sticking with the idea of what I'm calling dank distinction. And I want to think a little bit here about how relations of distinction from Bourdieu have kind of developed over the past couple of decades. So originally, those original studies kind of show how people kind of relating to each other, you know, in the same physical spaces, or excluding people from physical places, or, you know, through one-way media, that kind of, you know, consumption of media back before the internet. There's lots of work throughout the 80s and 90s that kind of start talking about omnivores and the blurring of high pop culture and how distinction starts to happen within pop culture. And I think we need to kind of rethink relations of distinction, you know, in this kind of platform capitalism age. And the work I'm drawing upon there is about infinite distraction, updating to remain the same, and ecologies of attention. I'm particularly influenced by Sian Nagai's work, who, if you're not familiar with, I strongly suggest everyone checks out her 3 amazing books, particularly the work on aesthetics, where she talks about interesting, zany, and cute being key aesthetics to understand our kind of contemporary cultures. I would like to add the aesthetic of dank to that, to think about, you know, kind of ugly feelings relating to class and masculinity. So what I'm analysing here is what I'm calling homologies of snark and organised online disgust. And these are kind of communities that develop around, whether it's an Instagram site or a Facebook page or whatever, that tend to be around taste cultures and morals. They're often characters kind of pretending to be someone that denigrate or take the piss out of, you know, other people's tastes and morals and cultures. What's interesting here is that and I'll get to this in a second, is these kind of characters, these people that kind of make up characters to do this, talk about how they're actually kind of pointing out problematic aspects of class, but really what I think happens a lot in this is there's context collapse, and people come along and just kind of then, you know, downwardly kind of laugh at people rather than kind of think more about the ironies and complexities of what's going on. I'll put that up there so you can see. The first person I'm going to talk about is Cook Suck. Began as a Tumblr blog. The guy that is Cook Suck kind of joked to me about how he has a semi-drinking problem, and when he was drunk at a night, he would write these kind of rants about other people's photos of their food and send it to his friends. He started a Tumblr blog. It grew and grew and grew. It now has 23,000 likes on Facebook. He's about 6,000 followers on Twitter, and he has 37,000 on Instagram. He's from a relatively low SES background, and he's also part of a kind of punk underground scene, and he sees what he's doing here, the character as a Cook Suck, kind of an extension of that kind of punk attitude towards, you know, people that he thinks are inauthentic. As this kind of character grew, he started getting contact from various commercial forces, asking him to kind of write for them. He did a few kind of magazine articles, and he also wrote some stuff for local breweries, but he knocked back the offer to write a book because he saw that as selling out. You can see here basically what he does is he really rips into kind of people, but he kind of does it through this kind of narrative. And what he also does in some of his stories as well is have a real kind of misanthropy, a general misanthropy about human race, but also then kind of this self-hatred thing that runs through it as well. And he draws upon a lot of the kind of things that youth studies looks at in terms of not being able to afford a house and not get a full-time job, and he kind of writes about that stuff as well. So when I talked to him about this and asked him why he does it, he says basically he likes taking the piss out of people that have delusions of grandeur, attempting to position themselves as someone better than you are. He argues that he tries to mostly punch up, but there was one particular incident where he wrote a review of a local RSL club where he kind of characterized what seemed to be kind of poor alcoholic. And he got a lot of flack from that. And he started to reflect on that. He even kind of wrote underneath it that he learned a lot from this and would try not to do that again. So when I asked him about that, he started talking about why things are funny and why things aren't. It's a blurry line. He argues that what he hopes to point out is that, classism exists, not that so much that he's trying to position himself better or worse than someone else. He argues that what he tries to do is kind of not just necessarily pay someone out, but kind of try and hold a mirror up to people, how they're kind of fooling themselves and how performativity online is not necessarily a good thing or things like that. The second case study is Truthless. I'll put that up there so you can see that. That's his artwork there. And now Truthless has become pretty huge. When I first started talking to him, he had about 30,000 Instagram followers. Now has 250,000. Truthless is a character, and he actually now talks in his own name in the videos and stuff as well, but I won't talk about him in his own name. He had a really unbelievable background where he grew up really poor. His dad got involved in what seemed to be some dodgy get-rich-quick things, and he got rich really quick, and all of a sudden he was a rich family. Then something went bad. His dad had to flee the country, and all of a sudden they were poor. He went to uni and got kicked out, and then he kind of went back later and did an advertising kind of graphic design stuff. But now he's basically started his own business and built it on this artwork that he does, where he sells merch and stuff like that as well. He talks about how he deliberately takes the piss out of Aussie masculinity and class identities, but also specific subcultures and fashions. And to add even more complexity, he says that he's basically taking the piss out of advertisers and their own stereotypical points of view towards things like class and masculinity. So why does he do this? He talks about how it reflects on his past. He sees things as a class war. He wants to take the piss out of upper class, the advertising niche who can't actually relate to the working class. He's trying to have a wide appeal, trying to have a balance, and he has a much more commercial relation to his art in that sense. He told me that he'd like to be the new Mambo, which was a really prominent kind of satirical surf brand in the 80s and 90s. He's also really interested in the way that kind of the internet works, and he talks about how everything is on the internet is ahistorical, everything is age and stage. So what's going on here? Well, similar to the way that immaterial labour works in the bars, there's a kind of whole bunch of, co-optation going on these platforms. So, the critique here, I think, is like interesting, and sometimes I find it funny, but there's also a lot of irony going on. It's really hard to kind of understand what the reception of this work is, and that's one of the things I'm trying to do. I'm going to try and interview some of the fans of these spaces as well. So what I also find interesting here is these things are really niche, and like there's pretty much, a Facebook side or an Instagram side of anything you can think of. But the more niche things are, the more the kind of algorithm learns and the more they can sell us stuff. So again, this immaterial labour going on is how value's created in capitalism. I'm not convinced that the critiques that they're making of things like masculinity, racism, nationalism and class relations are being interpreted as that by the audience. So it's something I want to investigate later on. So I see these affective taste cultures kind of classifying, classify the classifier in that Borgesian sense. But the relations that are kind of developed in these spaces kind of individualize, they drive anxieties, and they create animosity and sadness amongst the both the artists and the consumers. And this is the case in some wider research that's around these kind of relations. What I'm interested in here too is how the kind of dank aesthetic can kind of is prevalent in many different spaces, and it seems to kind of both represent progressive and reactionary kind lines of defence. Sometimes at the both at the same time. So again, to bring Bourdieu here again, a kind of very niche tastes, our habitus here in terms of what we're attracted to, the social gravity that we're kind of attracted to various things online becomes, aggregations of taste through this kind of affective homologies, the immaterial labour of the people both making them and consuming them, and this is kind of sees our very thoughts and feelings and practices and emotions extracted by and in late capitalism. I'm very quickly going to touch upon the work in Hipsters and in the Youth Class and Everyday Struggles book, and this is the work on Hipsters and Bogans. I think in the UK, the hipster is a very well-known figure. I did use a lot of examples from the UK in the book. The bogan maybe not so much, but it has some parallels with the chav. But I would say that it's not as mean as the way that chav is. I suppose there's been a bit more playfulness with the bogan. And I would say that since I wrote the book and in the last couple of years, if you were to do this work now, it would be completely different. The terminologies have moved on a little bit and they're treated a little bit differently now. And the bogan has been kind of somewhat playfully accepted more. It's not necessarily used in straightforward symbolic violence all the time now. So in that work, in terms of the symbolic representations of class that I was interested in, it was done at a time where there was like literally stories, news stories, opinion pieces in the newspaper and magazines and on various sites every day about hipsters and bogans, and they were particularly prominent in comedy in Australia and across the world as well. So in that work, I kind of make the analysis that the hipster tends to equate to middle class endeavours and is at least allowed a kind of reflexive irony. The hipster tends to be used in a much more playful way, where the bogan tended to be used in more straightforward kind of instances of symbolic violence and was a kind of voiceless cultural folk devil. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. When people are writing about these or when people are making jokes about them, they both enable distinction to be formed while certainly eschewing the very notions of class. And as I kind of said, the hipster is kind of a global figure. The bogan is local, but has its kind of cousins, I suppose, all around the world. And, to relate back to Bourdieu here again, figures classify and they classify the classifier. But what's interesting about these figures is that one person's hipster can seem to be another bogan, and the example I use for that is kind of me all the time. Like when I play cricket and I talk to my mates at cricket about what I did last weekend, and I say I saw some hipster band somewhere, they'll call me a hipster. And when I go to the see a band and I tell those people I played cricket, they think cricket's for bogans. So these kind of floating signifiers certainly attached to class practices, but they mean different things in different situations. So there's a fuzziness going on here about the kind of affective and symbolic class relations that I'm interested in, but still, who's doing the writing, who's making the opinions in the media, who's making the comedy in the films and the TV, tends to be, middle class people with lots of cultural capital, the kind of cultural intermediaries that are kind of central to the book distinction. So what's at stake? Both of the figures are used to kind of mostly as pejoratives, or at least take the piss out of various taste cultures, morals and values. But really the hipster has a lot of social homology with the people that are making these opinions and making the popular culture. So you could argue in many ways it's hipsters are the ones that are doing the talking. They're the ones doing the analysis of what's going on here. So there's a kind of reflexivity and irony, self-knowing, and this sees most of the jokes and the opinions that they're problematic hipsters, but they're not that bad. And then these pieces and comedies tend to provoke debates about issues. Bogans aren't really the ones in the media doing the talking, so there's a social distance going on here in terms of the analysis of what these things do. So there's much more straightforward symbolic violence going on there. Bogans are problematic because they're vulgar, aggressive, disgusting, and all that kind of stuff. The work on bogans tends to provoke complaint about morals. There's a kind of downward envy with the idea of the cashed up bogan, which is the kind of fly in, fly out coal mining worker that's on, about 150 grand a year. And this is the kind of stuff that these things bring together. There's also a kind of moral panic aspect to this stuff as well. Bogans represent the kind of those old threats of the bad lower class morals, vulgar and that kind of stuff. The MOBAs, I think the hipster's a bit more complex in the way that it's used. It's kind of always a critique of the precarious labour market, I think, embedded in this stuff, and the overload of irony and lack of originality in pop culture and stuff like that. So these kind of reinforce senses of place for whoever's kind of consuming this stuff in a number of ways in terms of how you relate to it. There's a sense of one's class place where social homologies, distances and limits are reflexively marked and socially policed in these pieces and in the consumption of them. And secondly, I think there's a generational kind of place as they mark relations to various fleeting contemporary notions of coolness, authenticity and taste. Okay, so lastly, I just quickly want to touch upon the work we've been doing with international students recently. And I suppose this section will kind of move beyond the affective and kind of, think here about not just kind of symbolic and affective violence, but really shows how inequality exposes people to, what looks to me much more like physical violence. So we did this research with 32 young hospitality workers in Newcastle and Melbourne. There was a kind of decent cohort of international students in that. And basically when COVID hit, hospitality shut down, as everyone knows. International students in Australia were given no support whatsoever. They had no access to what was called JobKeeper and JobSeeker. They were just left to fend for themselves. So Rosie, the kind of person I'm going to talk about here, she had 3 casual jobs, lost them all. She withdrew all her super funds to trying to get by. Had recently moved to a new apartment. So she had all kinds of stuff going on here. She tried to go home, but then the flight was cancelled. She actually tried to do that twice. So she withdrew off super funds to try and book again. That was cancelled. At about this time, the Prime Minister in public was talking about how, weren't international students getting support? She said that if they can't kind of fend for themselves, he said they should go home. And this kind of came up with all the international students. They all mentioned this. We didn't ask about it, but they all mentioned the kind of feeling really almost offended by the fact that they were going home. They were told to go home. So she starts trying to find work. Firstly, she found a job cleaning through Gumtree. This guy called her. Sorry, I can hear someone talking. A really weirdo guy called us, said, "Come right now. It's at this address. If I don't tell you," and she felt really uncomfortable by it. So she told a friend, "Look, I'm going to this address to do this cleaning work. If you don't hear from me in 15 minutes, you can call the police." This is the kind of risks that students were opening themselves up to. Her sense of unease about this work grew when she met the guy. It was really far away. She had to get to multiple trains to an outer suburb. She talks about how she doesn't have anything in her life to kind of do, so she had no options. She gets into the car with this guy to go and clean this house. It's full of McDonald's, garbage, shit everywhere, reeked of ketchup. He had old khaki pants on and he was old and his pants were falling off and all this kind of stuff. So she was instantly exposed to this kind of, what she felt was a very dangerous situation. She says to herself here, you finish your second degree, 4 languages and you're cleaning with this fucking weirdo. She's really starting to question what's going on here. The tipping point for her came when the weird guy asked to kind of clean these walls together. She basically gets out of there as quick as she can, particularly after she discovered that some of the products she was using to clean were toxic. So she gets out of there, she gets some money off him, but then this guy keeps hassling her up at night, texting her at 12:30 and that kind of thing. It was so creepy, so the only option she had was she stopped working there. She wasn't able to find any other work, and this eventually led to a participation in a paid drug trial. And actually when one of our team members was interviewing her on the phone, she was actually at the trial. Didn't want to do it, but it was a way of make money. Allows her to be kind of a little bit less stressed. So particularly here, the call to tell Rosie to go home was a kind of real betrayal of her expectations. She was doing all the right things that she'd been told from a young age to do, make the right choices, study hard, do the degrees, all that kind of stuff, build the cultural capital to get the career. But, she was experiencing a real disconnection from family structures, particularly because at home the pandemic was hitting so much as well. So again, effectively, these creates all kinds of ugly feelings: envy, anxiety, paranoia, and irritation. But what's important here is that these young women were banding together with their friends and communities to try and resist some of the things that are going on. We have some really great stories about, Sri Lankan international students being able to find some groups on Facebook that were giving them food and helping them out in this situation. But they were completely deserted by the government and really quite poorly supported by their institutions and the universities in particular. Okay. To conclude very quickly, throughout these kind of research projects, I've been thinking about effective relations of class, and particularly because I find some of the work on affect quite problematic. And I really like this quote that I discovered in Ashley Barnwell's work, but comes from an earlier paper by Hemmings. Affect is often riddle-like in definition, where scientists can detect it, philosophers can imagine it, but social scientists and cultural critics cannot interpret it. So I turn here to Weatherall's work on effective practice, and particularly in the Bourdieu and Affect book, I try and bring that kind of effective practice idea, thinking about who is effectively privileged, who can bank large amounts of emotional capital, and I bring that idea to some of Bourdieu's concepts to try and bring an effective kind of, I suppose, element to those that I think's already in them, but also to think a little bit about interpreting affect, the transmission of it, the way that it's structured, and that kind of thing. Affect theorists don't like to link affect with structure, and I never really understand that. Implications for bringing kind of implications from all these things together. I think more understanding needs to be sought about what youth does for the economy. And I don't mean just young people themselves. I mean figuratively, and particularly in terms of their immaterial labour. Because this is the way that capitalism kind of metabolises ever new frontiers. What I'm calling youthful cultural practices exist in effective economies, both online and off. And I think the examples between the bars and the kind of class stuff that online shows that. So certainly youth are materially exploited, as they've always been, but the immaterial labour is increasingly important to the way capitalism works. I'm theorising this at the moment around notions of dank distinction and homologies of snark that I'm developing in the work on the internet stuff. And I think this is the kind of way class is made in these everyday and often cruelly optimistic mundane practices. Importantly here, young people can be reflexively complicit in these relations, which is a concept I've been writing about in punk spaces that I'm going to bring to this work as well, but are usually in positions of having no real control over what's going on here, but are often then blamed for their apparent individual shortcomings that are really personal symptoms of systemic inequalities. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks. Oh, I'm getting a kind of reverb. Go back. Oh my God, Steve, thank you so much. That was really interesting. So fast.
I hope I stick to time. I'm sorry if I didn't.
Oh no, you did. Perfect. And so nice to get a full snapshot of different projects that you're working on, and then to try to think of the thread that runs through them. Yeah, I've got some questions about the effective. That was fascinating. But could everyone put some questions in chat? We're not questions now, but I'll collect the questions and then have them at the end and move on now to the next speaker. Steve, can I ask you? Are you getting an echo on my voice as well?
I am now. I wasn't before, but it's not too bad.
Okay, because it's really off-putting. Oh, it stopped. Thank God. Okay. So if you just put the questions, as I said, put the questions in the chat. I will gather them up and we can ask them at the end. We're going to move on to our next speaker, Fergal. Fergal, do you want to start the process of getting your slides onto the share space? And I'll just introduce Fergal. So Fergal Finnegan is my Borgesian friend. I've just realised I didn't actually do this deliberately, but it's become a bit of a Borgesian seminar this. So Fergal is a lecturer at the Department of Adult and Community Education, Maynooth, the National University of Ireland, and is co-director of the Doctorate in Higher and Adult Education and the PhD in Adult and Community Education programmes. Before becoming an academic, he was a community adult educator and literacy worker for a decade, and these experiences have strongly shaped him. His research interests include biographical methods, social class, access and equality in higher education, popular education, and social movements, as well as critical realism and Pierre Bourdieu. And I'm delighted to welcome Fergal here today, and I'm really interested in hearing more about his work. And it'll be interesting to think about the Borgesian approaches that are taken in all of these papers and how they help us to understand and make sense of youth experiences and struggles and labour market experiences, etc. Okay, so over to you, Fergal.
Thanks very much, Nicola. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you see my screen properly?
Yep. Yes, we can.
So I'm going to just, can you make that, maximize that, or is that okay? Okay. Sorry.
I think that's fine.
Okay, lovely. Okay, thanks very much, Nicola. Thanks very much, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here. As you can see, I'm going to talk about social class inequality in relation to higher education in Ireland, and I want to come at that from a particular angle. In a way, I've been doing it for quite a long time, 12 years, and I want to talk about how I've used a critical perspective. A bit like Steve, it's going to be quite general. It's going to give you an overview of that work. Talk about how that has influenced the way I've approached theory and methodology in a particular context. And then I think this is very important, I'm going to round it off with some reflections on how effective or ineffective that's been. And the motivation behind reflecting in that manner is very much linked to the seminar series themes, which resonated very strongly with me. I think we're in a very, very strange and in some respects anxiety-making time. And when I read through it, the seminar series overview, I was going, this speaks directly to my concerns. You know, I mean, what are we achieving through critical research? And I have to say, my over about 5 years, well before COVID, my mind has been returning repeatedly to a brilliant little pared down novel by Jose Saramago, which is quite dystopian, but book called Blindness. Like, so blindness emerges out of nowhere, takes over, people are sequestered by the state. That doesn't work, and it leads to all sorts of brutality. But the other part, apart from that anxiety that it registers, the other part that interests me in it is there's a very unsentimental but hopeful part to it, which is about how people reconstruct society through mutual aid and solidarity and love. And I think that we have to think in those sort of very broad and stark terms. And I say that as a researcher, but also as a father. And I think, you know, tackling social inequality is absolutely vital. Okay, so if that's the sort of general landscape, let me tell you how I broadly interpret critical research. Right? Okay, so there's 5 or 6 things that I would mention. First of all, I think it begins with a very strong commitment to equality and freedom as co-constituting values. And I mean, that gives a very familiar set of reference points, you know, to identify unnecessary suffering or harms, but also to explore where there's unmet needs and desires. At the same time, I think this is crucial, is we have to explore where there is possibilities for expanding reflexive agency in support of human flourishing. Now, I think none of that works unless we retain a sense of hopefulness, a sense of the not yet. You know, you can look to Ernst Bloch or Raymond Williams or whoever for that, but I think that takes active cultivation. It takes looking at how people change things and what inspires us. I think it is necessarily methodologically pluralist, but with a particular focus on how we democratize research relationships. And I think that's crucial. Yeah, this whole paper is based on the idea that we have to be reflexive on self-context and academic field, and that's crucial to critical research. And also, it may be self-evident, but it's worth saying that, you know, we are, one of the main purposes of critical research is to develop theory with explanatory depth. Now, I think there is, I think in doing that, I think we have to sort of decenter the academy. I think this is crucial for critical research, not to fall into those scholastic illusions which Bourdieu talks about, where, you know, we think what we say and what we write is of tremendous importance. Researchers are, to quote Bhaskar quoting Locke, are basically under labourers. And I think that from my perspective, this is premised on a particular understanding of how emancipatory social change happens, and that is primarily through social movements. So I think that's a way of framing this discussion. So from my own perspective, I'm interested in using Bourdieu and other elements as part of a praxis-orientated research. And I think that is, in a way, that the challenge there is to combine epistemological modesty with political boldness. And I think increasingly, as I do this type of work, I think it's useful to talk about what we hope might issue from research and the type of reforms we want to see. It's not always possible, but I think specificity is important. Okay, so having said all that, that's the sort of, you know, that's what motivates me to talk and reflect in this way. I've talked a little bit how I understand critical research in general. Now let me talk in a little bit more grounded way about the research in higher education and the Irish context. But first I want to talk about how class is dealt with in Ireland and what it might means to develop a theory with some explanatory depth. To my mind, it is made up of three moments, and I think it's confronting dominant myths. I think, and this is crucial, it requires an immersion and sustained attention to the complexity of lived experience, you know, how people perceive and experience class. I think it also means elaborating theory based on a critique of what's known. Now, in Ireland, I'm not sure of the context in Australia, but it's very different from Britain in the way class is mediated and talked about in general. And there's quite strong myths that have to be combated through any sort of critical account of class inside or outside of education. That it's sort of residual or marginal, that somehow the wonders of the economy are going to get rid of it. Or, you know, very commonly, I think this is influenced somewhat by Christianity and Catholicism, is this conflation of the working class with poverty, with the worst of disadvantage, and treating it in those terms. So in an Irish context, there are somebody saying lost sound. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I think it's just an individual thing.
Okay, so somebody's taken my my presentation from me. There we are. Okay, we're back. Okay. So, okay, sorry about that. Where was I? Yeah. So in making an account of class in an Irish context, there's a very well-developed body of stratification work that's, you know, close to that influences the state. There's a much smaller body of Marxist work, which is about state formation and mobilization. And I think the value of Bourdieu, it became very clear to me in reading across that. And I think Bourdieu's value in giving explanatory depth to questions of class is in moving beyond the trim notions of stratification and the overly tidy notions of politics and class formation processes, and holding onto the multidimensionality of class. And I think Steve was touching on that in various ways. From my own perspective, from an adult education perspective, I think Bourdieu is relatively weak on talking about the nature of personal and collective agency. Adult education has really foregrounded that, both in learning theories and in research that's come from people like Raymond Williams' cultural studies and cultural materialism, or E.P. Thompson's history from below. The other thing that I would say, which is relevant to this discussion, is Bourdieu is very weak in terms of his general critique of political economy, and I think that needs to be bolstered. But I think that offers a core for understanding critically class. And I brought that to bear on okay, I've just been muted, so we need to be careful there. Thanks. In an Irish context, we've had this extraordinary growth of higher education over a generation. It's really extraordinary. I mean, it went from the teens, like 15, 16,000 in the mid 60s to almost 200,000 now. And education has, higher education is now very central in social policy, central to how our society imagines itself and imagines progress. But of course, the ever-present problem for any human capital theorists and for Nicola, just when somebody keeps changing the settings here, so if we could sort that out, that people don't keep taking the screen back. Sorry about that. It's quite distracting.
What's happening? Your screen is.
Yeah, it keeps flicking. Yeah, it keeps taking it and sometimes muting me, so it's a little bit distracting. I don't know how that's happening.
Okay.
Anyway, we'll keep
Sorry.
an eye on it.
Okay.
No. Okay, so there's this ever-present problem of class inequality, and it's been proved again and again that this is a core issue within Irish higher education. Now, I'm very interested in how research on class has then informed the development of the access agenda, and that happened largely in the late 1990s, 2000s. And I think it's absolutely crucial from a critical perspective to note that the categorical trimmed conception of class associated basically with socioeconomic groups became the only way of talking about class and disadvantage. And alongside that, there sort of grew up a research monoculture source. And that meant that within Irish research, there was no real full account of working class perceptions or working class communities' needs or desires, and therefore no real sense of structure and agency. And whilst access has certainly made very, very significant gains, I think it's really reached the limits in its current form. And I think part of that is linked to the way class is mentioned and so, like the central theme, but it isn't articulated within a full theory of class. And that's led to a great deal of fragmentation. So the equity groups keeps getting redefined, and that's never framed in terms of causal mechanisms or general social measures which will affect it. It's just done in terms of participation rates. There's also this absolutely overwhelming focus on entry point, getting people into HE, and less interest in what happens in higher education, and just an assumption that it will lead to good work afterwards. I think this has become increasingly problematic because of the neoliberalization of Irish higher education, especially since the crisis. And I think that sort of instrumental orientation and even some interinstitutional competition is now going on with access and trying to remedy class inequalities. Okay, so from this particular context, I have elaborated with others, with Jerry O'Neill, with Ted Fleming. It's not simply on my own. A critical research methodology that responds to that, and very much about sort of talking to people before they go into college, as they go through college longitudinally, and into the labour market. It's been mixed age, it's not just youth, and of that, a large portion have been working class students using biographical interviews, which are spontaneous, interviewee-led sort of accounts of life and learning in as broad terms as possible. And that's been approached in as collaborative way as possible, and I think that's very much about trying to sort of recenter how we do research, to go back to an earlier point. Okay, so having discussed the context and theory methodology, I want to talk a little bit about some of the themes that have come from that research, and and do that in relation to the seminar themes, which is about belonging. So the first finding is not going to surprise anybody here, I don't think, and it's almost a banality to say it, but it has to be said and repeated because it's so important. The university still, or at least the very valued portions of higher education, are completely dominated by the upper middle class, and that gives rise to, you know, absolutely predictable feelings of a mismatch between somebody's class habitus and what they encounter in institutions. So, you know, you have James there, who's from Dublin's North Inner City, and despite really loving being in college, you know, he said, you know, after a couple of years, Fergal, this is still a foreign country to me, and I look around and I can't trust people because of it. And that actually has very profound effects in people's lives. Sometimes that dissonance can be productive. It's not always negative, but it requires a type of effort that just is not visible in the accounts of middle class students. And people are forced to make biographical and psychic breaks of all sorts. So Elaine, who walks out onto the front of her green and looks at her community, says, you know, a couple of years in, am I with them or against them, you know? People obviously talking about conflict and difficulty with friends. I think at a more dramatic level, people sometimes talk about a complete remaking of a self, and Niamh discussed, you know, identified her area with a lot of social problems, and there's been a lot of difficulties. And in sort of becoming, you know, she was doing very well in college, and she had a boyfriend from a posher area, and she began to sort of adapt herself. And you can see from that quote, you know, it took this very conscious distancing, which took an enormous psychic effort. However, when we think, when we use critical research to think about belonging, it's not a unidirectional thing. I don't think higher education is the same as it ever was, and I think we've arrived at a new moment in Irish education and even in working class culture, even bearing in mind the specificity of the research cohort. You know, that it's not indicative of working class culture in total, but I think it does say something important. And I think there is a sense that a generational exclusion and all the symbolic violence and real violence and difficulties people have encountered in education as working class people has been slightly overcome. And, you know, people talk about, well, I go to college and I'm proving them wrong, or, you know, Katie, we're as good as anybody else, we matter. And I think that's mainly it. And I think one of the things that I've been very struck by in doing this research has been the extent to which, even on courses which pedagogy is bad or it's the wrong choice or it doesn't particularly work, the people really value the time and space to reflect on their own life, and very often that takes that form of what if or what might be, and I think there is, as Peter Alheit, the German adult educator, has written, an explosive potential to thinking about that unlived life. The other thing I would say is that regardless of motivation, whether it's instrumental or whether it's vague, or, you know, whether it's just about the will to learn or et cetera, but repeatedly people talked about going to higher education and being in higher education and all the sacrifices they made to be in higher education in terms of a search for autonomy. Now, I know autonomy is one of those words which can be interpreted in all sorts of different ways. I'm using a definition from Castriadis, the Greek philosopher. And by autonomy, I mean allowing one's escape from the servitude of repetition, to reflect about oneself, about the reasons of one's thoughts and the motives of one's actions, guided by the intention of truth and the elucidation of one's desire. And I think it's very interesting that higher education is a space where it is being used for that, and people feel that they can belong to it to the extent that that's possible. And people repeatedly discuss this in terms of a loosening of a sense of being class as just being a community of faith. But so you have this quite complex moment in Irish higher education where there's a feeling of belonging and not belonging at the same time. And the major response to that from people is adaptation and ambivalence, and we've seen a little bit about that. Less so, but this does happen quite a lot, is that breaking with the background and remaking of self. And then there's two other strategies that have emerged from the research, which I think are quite interesting, and they're very much minority positions. One is where people talk about belonging not being important and basically focus on the present or in the very near medium-term future. And it's a different approach entirely. The fourth, again, is a very it's only a handful of people have reported that, but I think it's very important for some of the themes that I've already alluded to. People talk about a small number of people talked about class pride, and that's not a discourse which is as widely diffused in Ireland as it is in Britain. And when they talked about how that happened, I came to college, and it shows that I'm part of a class that's capable, and we're elaborating knowledge that is important to us. That was always linked to either engagement in politics by those young people, or having politics in their family, community, and egalitarian politics. And I think that's quite telling. Now, once we take that belonging, not belonging in higher education, it becomes much more complicated when you start taking into account what happens afterwards. And this is really crucial, and I say this to my colleagues and friends who resist the sort of vocationalization of higher education for all sorts of good reasons, but sometimes then become ignore the extent to which people go to college because they're in search of good work in terms of income conditions, but also developmental opportunities and autonomy as well. And I think you can't underestimate, again, the extent to which people are working out of personal and generational memories of bad work, of boredom, of subordination, etc. And it's not across the board, but a great deal, a very high number of people had internalized the sort of meritocratic ideals that are diffused through access and through society more generally. That it will be a level playing field. But the reality is much more troubling. That there's new forms of differentiation in terms of internships, or the little bit of the types of things you do in your holidays, or things like that, or the postgraduate degree, and that little bit extra is extremely classed. And it sometimes, if not quite fitting, can have an impact on your labour market outcomes. Now, it's important to say that significant transitions do occur, and on paper, if you're using like a basic stratification theory, people are upwardly mobile, but the conditions under which that happens are very difficult, highly precarious. Now, this was done in the sort of long afterburn of the Great Recession, so that doesn't need to be taken into account. But people like Kieran Burke have been talking about this as well, and I think it's an important aspect of thinking about class inequalities is thinking about work, and also the fact that there's some fuzziness in this, even though I think working class students are the most affected by these precarious conditions. That is shared by portions of the middle class. So there's a changing morphology there. So let me talk about one young woman to try and highlight these various themes. And Chloe was about 20 when I met her first, and she was from a very poor rural part of Ireland, where manufacturing had come and gone, but also traditional agricultural practices had been sort of barred through regulation and things like that. And she described a situation where her family had been precarious over generations. Interestingly, she also said, her family didn't have a great deal of cultural capital or knowledge of how higher education worked, and even though they were supportive, they couldn't support her in a very active way. Her school was actively discouraging of her going to university, and she had to push against that. Now, she arrived in university and she's still working part-time. Her finances are very, very, very tight, and she's almost like this highly aware, slightly silenced and slightly angry because the dominant culture doesn't sort of allow for who she is, you know, and she illustrated that in terms of waiting for the grant, etc., etc. But she absolutely excelled at college, and she saw herself as more hardworking than a lot of middle-class students. And that was sort of inspired by, look, I have learned things through my degree, which will help me understand, and now I want to help other people understand. And she had this sort of idea of being in an office and, you know, working on policy and having an impact. And, you know, it was highly motivating. Now, when I met her, like, I think it's 14 months later, she graduated, and she'd always said, you know, look, I'm well aware of credentialism, and, you know, she said you need a degree to work in a supermarket these days. But so she did go and get a master's qualification with a small inheritance. But the reality of work, and I think this is a little somewhat, there's some similarity to the story with Rosie that Steve was relating. She got paid work, and even though the contract was quite good, the conditions were very bad, and she felt vulnerable, and she also felt that she wasn't prepared, but that it wasn't right for the type of qualifications she had. And in narrating that, and this I think was very, very common to hear about the sort of receding horizon of expectations. Now, she wasn't saying that, you know, going to higher education was a waste of time or something that she hadn't enjoyed. That was held on to. But she said, you know, how to get where you want to be. It's so competitive, so many criteria. I've seen the lack of jobs. It's kind of disheartening as there's nothing out there for me, maybe in 10 years. And I think that story of what happens in the labour market is crucial in terms of really thinking about tackling inequalities in the sense that the seminar series lays out. Okay, let me round this off now. I've talked about how I conceive critical research, and, you know, based on critical theory and Bourdieu and critical realism and etc., and how that's been elaborated in terms of theory and methodology in a particular context. And, you know, in many ways, you know, I wouldn't want to make any excessive claims, but it is the most sustained project of its sort in Ireland. And there has been some theoretical and empirical advances. But nonetheless, when I review what I've done over the past 12 years with that praxis orientation that I discussed earlier, I think it's very important to say that it's had a very, very modest impact. And in what ways has it had an impact? I can say that good collaborative research relationships, particularly the ones which were longitudinal, I think were not just good for me, that people reported back, you know, actually this was engaging, and I learned something from it and was useful in various ways. Not always, but a lot of the time. I can point to changes in pedagogy and the departmental orientation, and even the way, you know, some research bids are approached in my own internal space. Jerry O'Neill and myself and other colleagues in Europe to try to develop a resource which, you know, in some sense has explained the rules of the game in terms of graduate employability to non-traditional working class students, and that was moderately successful, and I think has been useful in terms of sensitizing guidance officers, and we've had very fruitful conversations with access offices about that. So there is some successes, but modest enough. In terms of policy advocacy, very uneven. I think when I've been working with people from NGOs, like there's an organisation in Ireland which represents adult education called Aintus, and they, you know, it's their work, and when I've collaborated with them, things have happened. But most of the time when I've met with policymakers, I suppose understandably, what's actionable in the short term gets listened to, but the sort of discussion about, you know, the nature of social space and the nature of class inequality and the need to think in the medium term to address it tends to get sidelined. I have also thought, like Mike Rustin has also pointed this out in relation to SOSTRIS, I think doing critical research and funding modalities has to be thought together, because very often, even though there's an acceptance of mixed methods or qualitative research by funding bodies, you do have to promise a lot, and very often it's the time and space for critical elaboration that suffers. Now, I think everything I've said thus far has been relatively predictable. But I want to be self-critical, and I think I discern in looking back over my work the influence of a subtle scholasticism in what I've done. And I think it's very much in terms of the imagined sequence of the work and who you speak to about that, and particularly the modes of dissemination. And there's some work by people in this department, Sarah Meany, and also work by Vicky Duckworth and Rob Smith has made me think, that has to be thought about differently. And I would relate that to the rhythm of academic life. I think I'm sure people will. It's similar for many people on this teams, but it's this highly accelerated rhythm, which means that actually a lot of the time that's needed for careful exploration with groups, communities, and individuals is not allowed for. So you have to actively push against those conditions, I think. And I think more generally, it's made me reflect on alienation and the uses of alienation and the conditions of alienation in university life. And Richard Hall writes in a very interesting way about that. And I think what you have to acknowledge is how difficult it is in doing critical research to make those connections beyond the academy, which really make it live, and which can have the type of impact on inequalities that we hope for. So I'm going to leave it there, and hopefully that is of some interest, and I really look forward to the dialogue afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Fergal. That was really, really interesting and just a really thoughtful reflection on many things. And I think there's a lot of connection there with your paper and what Anne-Marie is probably going to talk about, and it connects very much with the Paired Peers project that we've been working on. So that's a really nice setup for the next paper. I'm really sorry about whatever technological issues were going on there. Hopefully that stopped, and I know how distracting it is when things are bleeping and things are not working when you're presenting, so apologies. Okay, so next we are going to have Anne-Marie. I am just going to share Anne-Marie's slides in a minute after I introduce her. I just love having multiple screens to deal with. So Anne-Marie is a professor of vocational higher education at the University of Birmingham. Her research focuses on questions of equity and inequalities in vocational, post-compulsory and higher education. Current and recent research projects include social class and social mobility through HE and into the labour market in England. And that's the Paired Peers project, which I've been working on as well, as have some of the other people attending today. And Anne-Marie has also done a lot of work around vocational education. Is very well known for her work in vocational education. She's got multiple projects running at the minute, despite the fact that she's was meant to retire. But I, like many other women I know who are retired in academia, they seem to be very, very active. So I'm going to hand you over to Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie, do you want to introduce your paper while I am trying to upload it?
Yeah, I will do. You can hear me, can't you?
We can hear you, yes.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks very much for inviting me to join this seminar. When I saw what the other speakers were talking about, I must admit I started thinking, why focus on inequalities and higher education? So I want to start just by setting a context, and I am going to talk very specifically about higher education and about the Paired Peers project. A number of the team are here today, and I'm going to talk about work that they'll be aware of and that they and I have been writing on for a number of years. So the project was a longitudinal project. We followed a cohort of young people who studied at the 2 universities in Bristol for 7 years. And the outline for this seminar asks us to interrogate the ways in which we conceptualise inequalities. For me, that includes deciding who are the subjects of interest. My research, as Nicola's just said, has involved overlapping areas of empirical interest concerning young people's experience of education, focusing on both vocational and higher education. Well, vocational education is historically where the major inequalities in the education and experience of young people are visible, and they continue to be visible in the English context. In upper secondary education, the best are sorted from the rest by the age of 16, and that continues. And the research literature in the field of vocational education and youth transitions in the late 20th century, which focused on the changing school to work transitions of these young people, who then represented just over 80% of the population, was a key area that I got involved in and was interested in. So why invest time and interest in inequalities in the experience of young people who participate in higher education when these appear to be the successful ones? This isn't just about the Paired Peers project. There's a huge research literature on higher education, which includes an extensive literature that addresses inequalities in a whole range of different ways. For me, one important reason for examining inequalities in HE relates to the massive expansion in participation in England and across the globe. In 1990, the participation rate in HE in England was 19.3%, so just under 20%. In 2010, when the cohort studied by our project started university, the participation rate was 46%, and by 2017, it was 50.2% in England. Our book on the first phase of the project, which explored students' experience of HE, called these young people the degree generation. We were highlighting how HE study has become part of the life pattern of half the young people of this generation. And in naming them the degree generation, we were pointing to the social and cultural conditions in the early 21st century where participation in HE has shifted from being a privilege for the few to becoming a right where many more people are able to access it, to becoming something which Trowers called closer to an obligation if you want to be even considered for skilled work. However, as was mentioned by the previous speaker, in the 21st century, graduate employment opportunities haven't kept up with high rates of HE participation. So a degree is no longer a guarantee of well-paid, high-skilled or secure employment. And yet, widening participation is still seen as a route to social mobility, and higher education institution websites continue to suggest that a glittering career awaits graduates from their degree courses. So what we sought to do in the project, and what I will aim to consider today, is what this means in the everyday experiences of young people at the present time. So what I'm going to move on now to talk about briefly is the project, the Paired Peers project, and then I'm going to try and provide very quickly some insights into the class journeys of participants in the project by looking at what sorts of things went on in moving into university and how class permeates everyday practices in HE, and then moving on from university and class to career making, and then finally the role of place and spatial mobility in realising both desired and viable futures. And next slide, please. Oh, next slide, please. Okay, the next slide will appear in any minute, I'm sure, but I do want to acknowledge the whole team of the Paired Peers project. That's
I'm
right.
going to interrupt you. Are the slides showing? Are they being shared, and are they moving? Because I've moved it along to project methodology, and I'm not sure that that's actually happening for everyone else as well.
No, okay, we're still on the overview, Nicola.
Okay, just give me a minute. I'm going to stop sharing and share again, and then start again, and hopefully that works.
Okay, and while Nicola's doing that, I will jump over this slide cruelly. I did want to just acknowledge that what I'm talking about today is the work of a whole team of people who've been working together since 2010, and I'm very grateful to the ideas and thinking that have come together as part of that team, which have made what I'm going to say today possible. Okay, next slide, please. And the next slide, yes. So the Paired Peers project, as I said, was a longitudinal project. We followed students from when they started their undergraduate degree course through to nearly 4 years post-graduation. So we followed them into their adult lives, their career lives, as well as their wider lives. We started off with 70 students from the 2 universities in Bristol, and we aimed to have half students from working class backgrounds, half from middle class backgrounds, and we go into detail about what that meant and how we did it in the book from the project. And then the second phase of the project followed 55 of the original cohort, all those who agreed to continue with us for the first 4 years of post-graduation. And our main method of data collection was in-depth biographical interviews, which covered a whole range of different topics. So we interviewed participants who were in phase 1 and phase 2 10 times overall, all the way through that period, and got to know them and their experiences really well. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to talk first of all about the sorts of ways I've been trying to think about our data just recently, and particularly in terms of spatial practices of graduate transitions to employment and future practices. Next slide, please. So I've been reading a whole range of literature from youth transitions literature through to student and youth geographies, as well as work on higher education participation and inequalities in higher education. And so my thinking's, I'm trying to bring together what that's meant in terms of my current thinking. Very much to be modern means to be mobile. In young people's geographies, there's a lot of talk about a mobility imperative. Since some considerable time ago, a notion that young people are seeking out cool places, and particularly in terms of concerns about the emptying out of rural places, that they're leaving rural places which are considered uncool, and that's occurring across a whole range of different countries across the globe. And in relation to higher education, that applies as well. In the higher education literature, there's an emphasis on how there are real dominant discourses about higher education, migration, mobility, particularly in England, where we continue to have a residential boarding school model, or finishing school as some have termed it, of transition to higher education, where you're expected to move away from your home place, you're expected to live in and be residential at university. And that's associated not just with spatial practices, but it has meanings, and it means freedom, it means independence, it means separating yourself from home and your family, and it means becoming self-reliant and responsibility for yourself. Next slide, please. But despite that mobility imperative, which has been noted and has actually been found, there's growing evidence of stasis. Young people who are not moving for study, and increasing numbers of those, and people who are returning home or actually staying in place for work after studying. And there's research which includes young people returning to the parental home. And there's increasingly loud voices in the literature pointing out that actually what the assumptions are about what students do in higher education in terms of their spatial practices aren't necessarily the same as what a large number of students in practice do. And linked to that are debates about what that means and the meaning of those those people who stay in place, and how significant that is, and suggestions that people who stay in place don't do so because they can't escape where they are, but they feel obligations to the place and want to be in the place that they're in. They value interdependencies, they value mutual support, and they feel a responsibility for others. And as Skeggs puts it, they have a sense of relationality. They want to put time and energy with others and into others. Next slide, please. So what we find in the literature on higher education is that there are relational as well as instrumental reasons for young people in higher education to stay or to return. There is a sense of social ties and sense of belonging, not just housing and debt. Family ties can be really important. Friends and partners can be local, and they're maintained throughout university study and then into employment. So while a family home might be a base that you go back to, where you have a look round before you settle in, or it's a launch pad for your career, or it's a place you can go and stay and save before you move on, and and a refuge while you're just waiting to work out where you go. For others, it is actually a preferred residence. And it can be to support parents, it can be because you feel comfortable, it can be because you feel part of the cultural practices that go on in that place. So place, in other words, isn't just a physical location, it actually represents deep connections to people and culture and identity. And people choose actively not to be pushed into mobility practices that take them far away from their home place because they participated in HE. Next slide, please. So what's being emphasised here is that there's potentially, however, a nexus between spatial and social mobility. It's not just, therefore, about the empirical significance of mobility and movement, but about the meanings and the outcomes of that mobility. So what diverse mobility practices make possible and what they potentially hinder. Next slide, please. And there's a real emphasis across different parts of the literature that it is possible that students who are able to maximise the positive associations of mobility can benefit from the social meanings ascribed to mobility. As Scheller and Yuri, who are very prolific in the field of new mobility studies, emphasise, mobility and control over mobility reflect and reinforce power. And Skeggs has pointed out that mobility is a resource which isn't available to everyone in the same way. And there's a real emphasis that, and I would want to emphasise this as well, that it's not, the question isn't to privilege a mobile subjectivity and work out how everyone can develop one, but rather tracking the power of the discourses and practices of mobility that create movement and stasis and work out the implications of that. Thank you. Next slide, please. And there's talk, therefore, across the literature of mobility as a form of capital in Bourdieusian terms that's differently available to students from different backgrounds, and it can be invested in. So it can be invested in, for example, at university through travel, through internships in distant locations and field work in exotic places and so on, and then mobilised to create continued advantage. And there's this lovely term motility, which appears across the literature as well, which is, however, a useful term in emphasising that you do not have to be spatially moving to have motility. You can have capacities for mobility without actually having to go anywhere. So, for example, a professional who works from home or who gets other people to do deliveries so they don't actually have to go to the supermarket. Whereas another mobile subject may be involved in a lot of moving about, but not have much motility in terms of capacities, a bit like the experience of the Spanish students and workers in Australia described in the first presentation. Next slide, please. So I've tried to use those ideas and think about those ideas in relationship to the data that we have on the experience of students in the Paired Peers project. And I'm going to talk about that very briefly from their experience of spatial practices in HE through to now being out in the world of employment. Next slide, please. So in a paper that I've published recently, one thing that struck us, and it struck us when in the book that we wrote about the first phase of the project, is that university spaces are spaces that are marked by social class. And here you have examples of how strongly both a middle class and a working class student at the University of Bristol, which is a high status university in Bristol, and is deemed to be a very homogenized, wealthy middle class space. And as Anna describes, she listens to young other students talking about their exotic extracurricular activities. Oh yeah, I went to like this place in Asia. Oh, I went to America. Oh, I was in Malaysia and my parents were in Beijing and we Skyped each other. And she's thinking, my God, how well traveled are these people? Creating, therefore, a space where you fit, if you fit with those exotic spatial experiences, or you wonder, what on earth am I doing here? And she notes also that they've got things in common. They've all been travelling. They can all socialise and identify with each other. This isn't just a working class student feeling out of place. Martha, an ordinary middle class student, points to just what that means in terms of how spatial practices affect what you can do in the academic as well as the social place. So those are the students who are running the activities, they're the department reps, and they've got the confidence to talk in lectures. And she points out people don't realise how much your confidence affects your ability to get the most out of your education, whether it's by feeling able to talk to a lecturer or ask for help and feel kind of able to bother someone like that. A real strong sense of what that space and the spatial practices of university are at the University of Bristol. Next slide, please. UE was described in similarly class terms. UE is a teaching-oriented university, but does a great deal of research and is a medium-ranking university and a post-92 university in English terms, but has a whole range of different students. Here, students talked about contradictory but still tangible class practices. The Lloyd, a middle-class student at UE, talks about there being horribly advantaged students and students that he talks about as what might be termed horribly chav, the ones chanting laddie songs in the street. But there's also people who are identifiable by their Jack Wills clothing and their expensive tracksuits or wearing pajamas in the day, which a lot of people do, he says, or wearing Hollister. And there's a class divide on the campus in the student accommodation, which the students delightfully call council court, alluding to social housing for students who live in one part of it, and a newer student village, which is more expensive and therefore probably for people who are a bit posher. And for one of the working class students at UE, and she wasn't by any means the only one, she rejects the whole student experience and moves back home, but feels very strongly pushed into thinking she ought to want the whole student experience, but realises she doesn't want it, realises she isn't happy, and she goes back home and carries on successfully at university, having decided that actually being pushed into being spatially mobile isn't necessary to succeed at university. Next slide, please. Moving on then to classed career making and the experience of constructing a graduate career future. Next slide, please. I just want to mention briefly that in another paper that I've just published, I've been talking about and engaging with this notion of graduate capitals, which is become quite an important part of the literature on graduates moving into employment. And I suggest that graduate capitals, while a useful way of trying to think about the sorts of things that graduates need in order to have a chance of making a successful career, it could also be seen in Bourdieu's terms as a form of symbolic capital that brought together these graduate capitals have sort of magical powers that apparently are going to make you successful, but actually they hide the power relations which involve in successful progression to graduate futures. And there's a real push that we found in all of our students' narratives of working class students working really hard to get a good degree, even though there was behind them this notion they needed other things. It's not just a degree that you need, but even parents and university tutors saying, concentrate on getting a good degree first. And university websites that continue to promote idealised career futures. Many of our graduates have secured employment in government, the civil service, non-governmental organisations, accountancy, human resources, media and journalism. And they don't mention things like financial help desk assistant, which not only I, but also the students hadn't ever heard of, but that's an example of one work that one of our students went into, or things like admin worker in an artisan company, which makes it acceptable for a graduate student to enter. Next slide, please. But what our participants found was that there was no clear idea or advice about how to find these other graduate jobs, the ones that aren't prestigious and visible. We found that our working class students, as well as our middle class students, had strong aspirations, but they didn't necessarily have much helpful direction. And it led to varying outcomes with extreme contrasts. So at the end of 7 years, so 4 years after graduating, one of our students was still, one of our participants was still struggling to find employment, and said, I still don't know what I want to do. I don't know how to plan it. I just think I have to not give up and keep trying. In contrast, another of our working class participants who had been fortunate enough to get a paid internship, and then to meet somebody who mentored her and encouraged her and pushed her, had been able to build on that and move her career, and now said, I want to work my way up the ladder. I want to have an influence on an organisation and an integral part. Neither she nor Jade were lacking in aspirations, but Adele, the second participant, commented on there, she had the opportunities by actually, in practice, a chance meeting with somebody who became a mentor. Next slide, please. Finally, I want to just talk very briefly about two of our graduates and just trace what happened to them in terms of their careers, and talk about this whole issue of spatial mobilities, about staying home and moving away. So next slide, please. First, I want to outline Ruby's experience of staying home. Ruby was a working class student. She studied English at UWE. She chose UWE because she wanted to be near home. It was within a car drive away. And although she's started being residential, actually her life was embedded at home throughout university. She lived at home after year one. She had a part-time job at home. Her social life was at home. She did things that were part of her home life. She played skittles. She was a member of a darts team. Her partner lived in the local home area, and she was really committed to her family. University wasn't the bubble that she went away to and left that family and home behind. For Ruby, she worked across her spatial practices involved moving between UWE and home and doing those things all through her studies. Next slide, please. And her career goal from the outset, and she said from when she was in secondary school, was to become a teacher. And it was a really focused career goal that she held to and she succeeded in. And that was really important, because if she was going to stay local, job opportunities in her home area were limited. She said there's lots of temporary jobs, supermarkets, but there's so many people going for one job, it's quite hard. And I looked up the area that she lived in, and it made very clear that there were really limited jobs for people who had got graduate qualifications in her area. So it wasn't just her imagination. She was absolutely right that you had to think hard if you were going to get a job in your local area. Next slide, please. For her, she redefined the home place. So although she wanted to stay in the home place, she also perceived herself as being the aspiring, hardworking working class. Her other working class friends that she had had when she was at school didn't have the desire. They wanted to just plod on. They weren't proactive. So she began to redefine what the home place meant. And this appears in other literature where the rural place is redefined as a place you want to be if you stay in it. So next slide, please. And she had an idyll about her rural area. Although she said she came from a not very pleasant working class town, she said, I love Somerset, I love the countryside. My house is surrounded by fields. This was the life she wanted to imagine herself in. And a really important goal was to buy her own home as soon as possible when she started work. Next slide, please. And so she managed to do that. For Ruby, what mobility meant was that she positioned herself as hardworking and respectable working class, and that followed in the footsteps of her father and her mother. But she didn't see herself as becoming middle class because she'd gone to university. She felt like she's still working class. And mobility for her was about staying in place, but redefining that place as somewhere that made for a viable and desirable future. So HE was a chance to gain secure employment, but also to distance herself from what apparently were unambitious working class peers. An emphasis in her life on interdependencies and connections to people, and very much a pride in herself and home. I want to turn now to Elliot. Elliot appears to be a typical middle-class student and a typical example of staying away. For Elliot, spatial mobility is embedded in his life. His parents moved to Northern Ireland, but they're part of ready-made social circles that are from England. He attended boarding school, which he described as a version of university colleges and halls. He didn't want to stay at university in Ireland because he thought that being close to home defeats the purpose of university. And both at university and after university, he moves between Bristol, Northern Ireland and London throughout, and is at ease in all those places. Next slide, please. And his career goal is journalism or writing. And in fact, he's as committed to that career goal right from the start as Ruby was to becoming a teacher. But he knows that this involves precarity and migration to London. He says there won't be many jobs where that I'd be qualified at home. And in fact, he has a brief spate at a newspaper in Northern Ireland and is told a couple of years back would have given you a job, but we can't do that anymore. Next slide, please. So his actual experience of, next slide, please. And so he embraces mobility and uncertainty. He has multiple different jobs and experiences, all these different things in the period of 3 years until he ends up as an economics reporter for a free newspaper in London with a big city readership. All this is made possible by lodging with friends and family, and the writing is based on his experience of studying English. His knowledge of economics is not. That's based on Economics for Dummies, which he bought just before he got the job. Next slide, please. So home isn't a fixed place. He anticipates staying in London because that's where the future for work is. And anyway, his family home is not where his friends are. They've all left home and spread apart. But he does also have that hankering for open spaces and can't quite handle city life the whole time. Quite different to owning his own place. He finds his own rented place to live at the end of 3 years, and up till then has been almost doing the equivalent of couch surfing so that he can keep going and find places to live while he's working. Next slide, please. So for him, what mobility means is, again, making his desired career viable, but it means moving to where the prestigious work is, but very much a sense of his self-reliance and responsibility and independence, which comes from his family, but he's got his family as a backup. If anything goes wrong, he knows that he can go back to them and they will help him, and they also help him along the way. Sees himself as very similar in class right from the start to the end, and similar to his parents' class position in the professional classes with a below average salary. Next slide, please. So I just want to talk then, in conclusion, about how that might suggest what's going on in terms of spatial practices of young undergraduates and graduates at the current time. Ryan, in his work on mobility and spatial practices, talks about Bourdieu's concept of the habitus, and he argues that the habitus sets an imprint on future actions, but that's not the same as claiming that it represents an obligatory and narrowly predefined path with no escape opportunities. There's a two-way relationship, and people like Nicola and Jesse Abrahams, who are part of the project, as well as other people, have talked about that opportunity for building on the habitus and moving between different experiences and making differences in the experience that the habitus then engages with an opportunity rather than a threat. I've looked at how that plays out in the experience of university students. First of all, I tried to indicate how everyday spatial practices in HE are not open and welcoming to all. Their experiences tangibly classed by the participants in the Paired Peers project. And they then spoke briefly about the problematic nature of developing graduate capitals. And finally, I turned to the more detailed narratives of Ruby and Eliot, which present very different versions of mobility. Both of them could be seen as successful, but they also read as confirming typical classed mobility practices and experiences. So the intention here is not to privilege the mobile subjectivity of Eliot, but rather trace the way in which the positions and dispositions of these two young people affect practices of mobility and create movement and stasis. In Ruby's determination to move on but stay in place, I'm struck by the possibility of an unspoken but deep determination to find security. And this fits very well with what we've just heard about Ireland. Skeggs, in her work, emphasises how much working class lives are affected by long-term precarity. The opportunities that HE holds out for aspiring working classes is actually to escape this precarity. And that's not the same as leaving your class behind, which Ruby is emphatic about. It's about defining where you fit into a class environment and then having the capacity to reject the mobility imperative, particularly the taken for granted expectations of undergraduate and graduate mobility practices. Eliot's experience appeared to be much more haphazard and unstructured, but that didn't unsettle him. His habitus was built on migration as part of life, which contributed to his underlying confidence in himself and his capabilities. Knowing and being sure of yourself, along with family capitals to make use of and fall back on, enabled him to engage in very different mobility strategies to Ruby. So to conclude, the implications here are not straightforward, but what the data do suggest is the need to challenge our taken for granted assumptions about the mobility imperatives associated with going to university and progressing on from university. And through this, interrogate the ways in which accepted practices contribute to maintaining inequalities rather than opening up opportunities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ari. Yeah, hold on, I'm just going to stop sharing that as well. So yeah, that's fantastic. I think there was some really lovely overlaps between all of those papers, and I'm sure there are lots of questions for the three speakers. We can do two things. If you have a question and you want to ask the question yourself, can you raise your hand using the little raise hand function? And if you want to ask the question, you want me to ask it, you can put it in the chat. So questions for the speakers, please. Okay, Saul, I saw your hand going up. Is that right?
Hi.
Hi, Saul.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for those great papers. My question is to Fergal, and I've just been typing out some thoughts, but I won't go through all of that. I just ask, what do you think the role of sociologists, and maybe sociologists of education or education researchers, is in building class power in education and beyond? And are the sort of practical implications of this antithetical to gaining funding? And I think also there are bigger questions, maybe, which you might be able to comment on as well, about our framing of class within sociology and the historical focus of that on access, and what that does to the way we think about class within education and its broader implications to practically change things.
Nicola, should I just go ahead? Yep.
Yes, do. Just go for it.
I mean, it's a very big question. I don't think I'm going to be able to give it an adequate answer very briefly. But I think what I was trying to say in the beginning is that I think developing and sharing and articulating in our networks very clearly how we think emancipatory change happens, and saying, well, okay, modestly, truthfully, what can we do? And I think it is a type of underlaboring. I think there is a particular, I think the strength of good education is in giving space for reflexivity. That's not the same as creating spaces for mobilization. So it does have a specific value. In terms of creating theory, I think it means having the time and space to work in a critical way, in a non-ideologically predefined way, and then bringing that back for discussion and collaboration. I think there's a much, when I'm trying to reflect on what was happening there, I think, for instance, working class studies and working class studies developed curricula might be more powerful than trying to push on the access agenda. And finally, of course, in terms of funding, of course, it means saying, well, sometimes it's less important to have funding and it's more important to do the work with communities and do the work with organizations and be truthful about what's going on in the university. I very brief answer, but very happy to talk further. Nice to see you here, Saul.
Okay, thank you, Fergal. There are a few points / questions in the chat. Helen says to Anne-Marie, I suppose an obvious point of discussion here is thinking about the implication of COVID on these spatial practices. Anne-Marie, do you want to say a little bit more about that and about the shifting employment landscape, I guess, and COVID and what that might mean in terms of mobility? Oh, Anne-Marie, you're on mute. You're going to have to unmute your mic.
There we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think there are people here as well who are writing about the shifting spatial practices of undergraduates and graduates that happened, as we already heard, in Ireland following the 2008. That happened in England as well. So some of the experience of the participants in paired peers was following on from the challenges then. So although this is a much bigger challenge, there are experiences of these things happening previously. I think I was fascinated by the fact that actually when you look at the evidence and the data, the statistical data, there is more stasis, both in terms of progressing to university, but also looking for employment. There's more people staying local than we think. So that mobility imperative is very much a discourse and a rhetoric, which doesn't mean to say that will prevent people from having real challenges in their local areas. But it does mean that there's a different set of practices that means that you're sitting potentially employed or potentially unemployed, not necessarily having to make decisions about moving back because you're potentially staying in place. And there's also interesting work going on around, certainly in the social geographies literature, around what it means to both invest in left behind places, as the UK government would call it, but also the shifts in the possibilities for moving around, so that travelling for an hour for work or working from home start to change the possibilities and opportunities for work. So I'm trying to have a kind of optimistic hope there, whilst I think, thank goodness, I'm not looking for employment at this moment in time. As a young person, it feels like a very pessimistic moment to be looking for employment. And then the additional thing that I would say is that what also surprised me in our project is how little the people in the project were given help in understanding what employment was available and finding out what jobs people do, jobs that I've never heard of, because all we talk about is teachers, lawyers and doctors still. I mean, that's a slight extreme, but we really don't have a sense of what sorts of things people do or where to look for them. So looking on Gumtree, which people did at the beginning of the 2010s, isn't where I expected them to look. I thought they just sold secondhand bicycles. There's a whole different world out there of what goes on with careers. And I think COVID will make that not only more difficult, but will give people who haven't got the social connections and family connections to help them find ways through it, both economically and through thinking of ways that they can look for whatever employment there might be, will find it even harder than ever.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. I have another question here from Nina, which I think is actually quite relevant for all of the speakers, and it dovetails with your response there, Anne-Marie. Are there insufficient jobs for graduates? If this is the case, would it be appropriate to reposition education as part of creating a good life rather than something that should be converted into human capital? And yeah, I think that I can see how that connects to the talk, all of the talks. So perhaps we could hear from Steve to begin with here.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, so it resonates with some of the research that I wasn't talking about in the presentation that we did, but other research I've been doing with Penny Jane Burke that we called Struggles and Strategies around. There was somewhat modelled on the Paired Peers project, and that we've been seeking funding to expand it across multiple institutions across Australia. So yeah, I think it relates mostly, I think, to the kind of ever-increasing upward credentialising of the labour market that young people have been experiencing from probably the early 90s, and the way that those expectations haven't really leaked into the way that universities market themselves, talk to their students, and certainly in terms of the expertise that's in universities, and as Anne-Marie was talking about, in terms of discussing what the actual realistic possibilities are. I mean, as academics, we don't really know because we're in a kind of institutional situation there. We don't have to really face those things. I always feel quite embarrassed when I'm asked about career advice from my students, because I haven't really done anything outside of academia the past 15 years. I don't really know what's out there other than what I read. So I think universities have been really weak in terms of getting that expertise into the system. We increasingly have things like work placement and stuff in our degrees, but yeah, I think the kind of aphorism you said there, Emery, about it's all about something like teachers, lawyers, and that's so true. And again, that's the marketing that universities use, but really not many of our graduates take up those things. And I think it's similar in Australia and the UK. And they're increasingly going to all kinds of spaces that don't really fit that stereotype that universities still market it themselves as. And for me, that's a really good example of how universities make class. They just certainly don't ameliorate it, or you know, they're not a panacea for it. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. That's really interesting, and I think that idea of universities making class and then thinking about how some of the young people in your study were remaking employment through alternative forms of employment and finding new spaces and sort of redefining labour markets. I think that the question very much ties into Fergal's discussion of the project of autonomy, and that made me think of the project of autonomy versus what's really prevalent in the UK, the project of employability. So I wonder if Fergal could maybe say a little bit more about the project of autonomy and connect that with Nina's question about redefining educational goals and the good life, etc.
Yeah, I mean, like the obvious answer is there is not enough high quality, good graduate jobs. That's definitely clear. But that's to do with the way we organize work, which I think is what Nina's talking about. And I'm very taken. I mean, I really think thinking carefully about the nature of paid work and unpaid work and how we relate work to universities is a fundamental question, not just because of AI, not just because of graduate inequalities, but because of social justice more generally. I'm very taken with Paul Gomberg's book on contributive conceptions of work, and what he's essentially saying is that unless we think about dividing up tasks differently in society, we won't undo class inequalities. Because if you confine people to routine, boring jobs, even if they have professional titles, and a small minority of people get developmental, high status, stimulating work, then you know it's class inequalities are going to get reproduced again and again. I think that's a big task, but I do think universities, departments, and guidance counsellors being realistic about what's there and giving people the full range of information of what's out there, because definitely employment is different by discipline. And for instance, a lot of working class students are going into social sciences and social policy because it's proximate and it's not where they're getting jobs. So I think that there's a sort of immediate set of things that we can do, but there is ultimately we have to rethink what we mean by good work. And I think it means doing so in an egalitarian way. Thanks.
Thank you. I don't know if you're aware of the work of Andrew Morrison at Sheffield Hallam University, Fergal, but he's written a really nice paper on those issues using Gomberg's work. My chat seems to have just all blanked out, but I noticed that Harriet Bradley had a question. Harriet, would you ask your question, because I cannot read it because my chat has just gone crazy. You need to unmute your mic to ask the question.
Hi, I had two questions actually. One was that I wanted Steve to explain a bit more what he meant by immaterial work, which I thought was interesting, and it obviously ties back to that issue we've just been talking about, the new types of work that might develop, and particularly that's crucial after COVID, I think. And the other question was for Fergal, which was just to ask if the outcomes for the students that he studied were different by gender, because well, it's really a way of saying are class relations gendered as well, and you obviously just gave one example of an outcome, so I just wondered if you could say something more general about what happened to male working class and female working class people. Thank you. So that's two questions. one for each of you.
I can go first, and it'll be pretty quick, I think. Yeah, so the idea of immaterial labour is developed out of a bunch of Italian Marxists through the 80s and 90s and recently, that essentially asks us to think about labour, not just about the production of products and things, that increasingly the new economies are about producing symbols and effects and feelings, and they're often the things in service economies and experience economies that are things that are being sold to us. You know, young people in the bars that I'm talking about, for instance, are certainly pouring beers, and so they're, you know, servicing. The beer's important, the product's important, but they're also there to create a vibe. There's a lot of aesthetic labour going on. You know, you have to look the right thing. The girls tend to be conventionally attractive, even if they might be more, you know, punk or whatever to fit in a particular scene. So the work they're doing isn't just pouring the beer in that situation. It's creating an aesthetic, a feeling in that place that it's going to attract people to come to it, which they obviously don't get paid for as well. So that's essentially what the idea of immaterial labour, like emotional labour and those other kind of theorisations, are meant to kind of conceptualise, I suppose.
Thanks, Steve. Fergal, do you want to answer the question around gender?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question, Harry. The short answer is that yes, there's no way it is gendered. Class is gendered. There's no doubt about it, and the research indicates that it is so, but not in a straightforward, linear way. I think age matters a lot as well, and I would say in amongst the interviews I had, certainly young working class women were slightly more likely to do that adaptive changing of identity than young working class men. People who've been out in the labour market, even if they're young, had a different sort of relationship to their class identity, and that was gendered. I think choice of discipline is important in this respect. Like for one of the areas where people can go into after graduation, which seems to be less class, there's less class closure, is computer science, for instance. You know, that but that is a gender set of choices. I think one of the really profound things is love's labour. Unpaid care work is still highly gendered, and that plays out in working class and middle class women's lives differently. So in all those ways, gender is crucial, but it doesn't work in one particular direction, if that answer helps. I hope it does.
That's great. Thank you, Fergal. So we're really at the end now, so we don't really have time to ask any more questions. And I know there were a couple of people who had some other points to make, and a hand was up. But maybe you can follow up by contacting the speakers directly, if that's okay with you. If people can email you if they want to hear more about your work. And yeah, just to say thank you so much. I know that we can't do a proper round of applause, but just imagine the applause. Thanks so much to all three speakers. They were really excellent papers, a lot of food for thought, really nice connections between them all, and yeah, certainly taken a lot away from this myself. And I just want to point everyone to the link that I put in the chat, and that's just some details about the next seminar on the 24th of March. And we've got 3 other wonderful speakers lined up for that. So just a final goodbye and a final thank you to our 3 brilliant speakers. And Steve, you can go and have a nice glass of wine or bottle of beer now, because it's evening where you are. But thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Nicola, and everyone else for organising it. Really appreciate it. And I really enjoyed Steve and Anne-Marie's paper, so really appreciate this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I will be in touch with you all soon. Thanks a lot. Bye. Thanks everyone for coming as well. Okay, cheers. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.
Hi, Anne-Marie.
Hi, yeah, I'm still there.
Thank you so much for that. That's great.
Great. Was that okay? Yeah.
Yeah, it was And it's a kind, I could see a nice we still have people here, by the way.
Okay.
Yeah, I could just see a nice mash up there between your published the stuff, that the paper that I read that you were publishing, and then the chapter. I thought that was good. Yeah, I really liked that. And
they were really interesting papers, all three. I thought that worked really well together.
Yeah, I did. I really enjoyed. Yeah, I think everyone else has gone, it's just us. But yeah, I did. I really enjoyed those three papers, three very different papers. I mean, Fergal's paper was very obviously, had a direct link with pair peers, but I think that Steve's paper was really interesting, thinking about the different forms of labour and the kind of the things that are just not thought of, and the remaking of labour markets and just those kind of protracted experiences onto the labour market.
I think what really stood out for me was in his work. I mean, obviously it's much more kind of all sorts